Miss Marple and the letter posted after the murder. Welcome, dear listeners. I'm Ailey, your host from Cafe Tales, and I'm so glad you're here with us tonight. These mysteries have a special way of bringing us together, no matter where in the world we may be. Tell us in the comments where you are listening from, and don't forget to subscribe as new stories arrive every day. Now, make yourself comfortable, wrap up in your blanket, and let's begin tonight's mystery. The afternoon sun slanted through the mullioned windows of St. Mary Mead's post office, casting long shadows across the polished counter, where Mr. Lorimer stood, arranging the day's receipts with mathematical precision. His thin fingers moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent the better part of 20 years, ensuring that every stamp was properly affixed, every postal order correctly endorsed, and every parcel weighed to the nearest ounce. The high street beyond the glass door hummed with a familiar rhythm of village life. Mrs. Dolly Bantry's rolls had just pulled up outside the draper shop, and through the window Mr. Lorimer could see her emerging in a flutter of autumn tweeds, her voice carrying clearly as she called out to someone across the street. The church clock had recently struck 4, and the afternoon light was beginning to take on that particular golden quality that spoke of tea time approaching, and another peaceful day drawing to its close in England's most tranquil village. Or, so it seemed. Mr. Lorimer adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and returned his attention to the ledger before him, his pen scratching methodically across the page. He was a man who took pride in order, in the neat columns of figures that told their own story of postal efficiency. Each transaction was recorded in his precise copperplate hand, each stamp accounted for, each postal saving carefully entered. The post office under his stewardship ran like clockwork, and he intended to keep it that way. The bell above the door chimed softly as Edwin Pratt entered, removing his cap and smoothing down his unruly brown hair with nervous fingers. The young man served as relieving counter clerk, though his eagerness to please was often undermined by a tendency toward clumsiness that made Lorimer wince. Edwin approached the counter with the diffident manner of someone perpetually expecting criticism. "The afternoon collection's ready for sorting, Mr. Lorimer," he said, his voice carrying that slight tremor it always held when addressing his superior. "In good time, Pratt. First, ensure the late fee box is properly labeled. Yesterday's effort was barely legible." Edwin flushed. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." As the young man hurried away, the door chimed again. This time it admitted Dora Pike, the proprietor of the village tea shop, her normally cheerful countenance clouded with worry. She was a woman of middle years with graying hair pinned neatly beneath a small hat, and hands that bore the permanent, slight staining that came from years of handling tea leaves and cake tins. Today, however, there was nothing of her usual bustling confidence about her. "Good afternoon, Miss Pike." Lorimer's tone was professionally cordial, though his eyes held a flicker of something that might have been weariness. "How may we assist?" "You today? I need to speak with Mr. Fenna. Is he about?" "I believe he's in his parlor through that door, if you please." Dora Pike's mouth set in a determined line as she made her way toward the indicated door. Even through the thick oak panels, the raised voices that followed were clearly audible to those in the main office. Edwin paused in his labeling, his eyes widening while Lorimer's pen ceased its scratching entirely. £30 more, a quarter. Dora's voice carried clearly. "Mr. Fenner, you cannot be serious. The tea shop barely turned a profit as it is." Basil Fenner's response was lower, more measured, but no less firm. The retired apothecary had always been a man of exacting standards, whether in his former profession or in his current role as one of the village's more prominent landlords. His voice held that particular tone of patient authority that had once accompanied his dispensing of medicines and advice in equal measure. The property requires modernization, Miss Pike. The electrical fittings alone are a decade behind current standards. If you cannot meet the adjusted rent, I'm sure I can find a tenant who can appreciate the improvements. Improvements? The word carried all of Dora's frustration. Sir, you know perfectly well that Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Davies, and young Mr. Collins all take their afternoon tea at my establishment. The village depends on my little shop. You cannot simply— I can and I shall, Miss Pike. Business is business. The conversation continued in this vein for another quarter hour, during which Edwin made a great show of attending to his duties, while clearly straining to overhear every word. Lorimer, for his part, maintained an air of professional disinterest, though his pen remained motionless above the ledger, and a small muscle in his jaw had begun to twitch. Finally, the door to the parlor opened with rather more force than necessary, and Dora Pike emerged, her face flushed with anger, and what might have been the beginning of tears. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said with forced civility, her voice shaking slightly. As she passed the counter, she paused and looked directly at Lorimer. "Mr. Lorimer, if anyone should ask, I left Mr. Fenner at precisely 20 minutes to 5. Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Davies, and Mr. Collins were all present in the shop to witness my departure." With that, she was gone, the bell above the door chiming, with unusual violence as it swung shut behind her. Edwin cleared his throat nervously. "Rather upset, wasn't she, sir?" "Miss Pike has always been prone to dramatics," Lorimer replied coolly, returning to his ledger. "Now, about that late fee." Bucks, the minutes ticked by with merciful quiet. Edwin attended to his duties with unusual efficiency, perhaps motivated by the afternoon's tensions, while Lorimer completed his daily accounts. The church clock chimed 5 o'clock and then quartered, marking the steady progression toward evening. It was at 10 minutes past 5 that Edwin, returning from the rear sorting room with an armload of parcels, stopped short with a gasp that was audible throughout the building. "Mr. Lorimer, sir, you'd better come quickly." The urgency in the young man's voice brought Lorimer around the counter with surprising speed. Following Edwin toward the back of the building, he found himself at the open door of Basil Fenner's private parlor. The retired apothecary lay crumpled beside his desk, his neat gray head at an unnatural angle, a spreading pool of dark liquid staining the turkey carpet beneath him. The heavy iron doorstop that normally held the parlor door open lay nearby, its base dark with what was unmistakably blood. Edwin stood frozen in the doorway, his face white as parchment. Is he? Lorimer pushed past him and knelt beside the fallen man, his fingers seeking a pulse at the throat with the brisk efficiency of one accustomed to practical matters. After a moment, he sat back on his heels. "Dead," he said quietly. "We must telephone for Dr. Haydock at once and inspect Slack." As Edwin stumbled toward the telephone, Lorimer remained crouched beside the body, his sharp eyes taking in the scene with the same methodical attention he brought to his postal duties. The dispatch box that Fenner kept on his desk lay open, its contents of carefully filed papers and notes scattered across the floor. Yet nothing seemed to be missing, and Fenner's wallet, visible in his inside jacket pocket, appeared untouched. The iron doorstop lay some 3 feet from the body, as though it had been dropped or thrown aside after the fatal blow. Lorimer studied it for a long moment, noting the way the blood had pooled and begun to congeal, before rising to his feet with a troubled expression. By the time Dr. Haydock arrived, followed shortly by Inspector Slack, and the usual complement of village worthies that such events inevitably attracted, the sun had nearly set, and the post office that had begun the day in perfect order now stood as the center of St. Mary Mead's most shocking crime in living memory. Time of death? Inspector Slack inquired brusquely, as Dr. Haydock completed his preliminary examination. "Somewhere between 5 o'clock and 20 past, the doctor replied, straightening his back with a grimace. The skull fracture was massive. Death would have been instantaneous. Among the small crowd that had gathered, Miss Jane Marple stood quietly near the window, her mild blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene with the same careful attention she might have devoted to a particularly challenging piece of needlework. She said nothing, but her fingers worried at the yarn in her knitting bag with unconscious anxiety. The peaceful afternoon in St. Mary Mead had come to a most violent end. The morning sun had barely crested the elm trees that bordered St. Mary Mead when Mr. Simmons arrived at the post office in a state of considerable agitation. The solicitor from Downshire was not a man given to dramatics, having spent the better part of 30 years dealing with the mundane realities of wills, property transfers, and the occasional boundary dispute. Yet today his usually composed demeanor had given way to something approaching panic. Inspector Slack, who had returned early to continue his investigation, looked up from his examination of Basil Fenner's scattered papers with barely concealed irritation. The inspector was a man who preferred his mysteries to unfold in an orderly fashion, and the arrival of an obviously distressed solicitor at 7 o'clock in the morning did not fit his plans. Mr. Simmons, isn't it? Rather to be conducting business, wouldn't you say? Slack's tone held that particular note of forced patience that suggested his morning tea had been insufficient. The solicitor clutched his leather briefcase with white-knuckled intensity, his normally immaculate appearance showing signs of hasty dressing. His waistcoat was buttoned incorrectly, and his usually perfectly groomed whiskers bore the telltale signs of a man who had forgotten to look in his shaving mirror. "Inspector, I must speak with you immediately. Something quite impossible has occurred." Simmons fumbled with the clasp of his briefcase, his hands trembling slightly. From the case he withdrew an envelope with the reverent care one might reserve for a dangerous explosive. The paper was of good quality, cream-colored with a slight watermark, and addressed in a spiky, distinctive hand to Mr. Simmons Esquires, solicitor, Downshire. "Well?" Slack demanded. "What's so urgent about a letter?" "Inspector, this letter is from Basil Fenner." Simmons's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Posted yesterday evening and postmarked at 7:42. The significance of this statement took a moment to penetrate the inspector's consciousness. When it did, his expression changed from irritation to sharp attention. "Posted yesterday evening. But Fenner was dead by 4:45. Precisely." Simmons set the envelope on the counter with the care of a man handling a sacred relic, which makes this letter quite impossible. Miss Marple, who had arrived early to offer what comfort she could to poor Edwin Pratt, moved closer to examine the envelope. Her mild blue eyes studied the postmark with the same attention she might have devoted to a complex pattern in her knitting. "May we see the contents, Mr. Simmons?" she asked gently. With obvious reluctance, the solicitor withdrew a single sheet of paper from the envelope. The message was brief, written in the same spiky hand as the address. "Dear Simmons, if harm should come to me, look to Dora Pike. Her threats today were explicit and witnessed. I fear for my safety. B. Fenner." The silence that followed this reading was broken only by the steady ticking of the post office clock and the distant sound of Mrs. Bantry's gardener beginning his morning labors. Inspector Slack was the first to speak. "Well, that settles it then. The man must have gone out after Miss Pike left him, posted the letter on his way back perhaps, then returned to meet his killer." "But, Inspector," Edwin Pratt spoke up nervously from behind the counter, where he had been sorting the morning mail, "that's not possible. I mean to say, if Mr. Fenner had gone out after Miss Pike left, surely someone would have seen him. The high street's not so very busy at that time of evening, but Mrs. Henderson and her daughter were just leaving the tea shop, and young Mr. Collins was walking his dog past the church. Someone would have noticed. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A very good point, Edwin. Tell me, Inspector, which pillar box would Mr. Fenner have used? Does it matter? Slack suggested he found such questions tiresome. Oh, but it might, Miss Marple replied mildly. You see, if we know where the letter was posted, we might better understand when. Mr. Lorimer, who had been listening to this exchange with the strained attention of a man under considerable stress, cleared his throat. If I may, Miss Marple, there would be only one logical choice. Our pillar box here has the late fee collection, which operates until 6:15. After that, the main pillar box down by the church has collections at 8:30 and 11. Given the postmark time of 7:42, it would almost certainly have gone in our late fee box. How very convenient, Miss Marple murmured, though whether this observation was directed at the postal system or something else entirely was unclear. Inspector Slack had begun to pace, a habit that invariably accompanied his attempts at deductive reasoning. So Fenner writes the letter, posts it in the late fee box before 6:15, returns home and then encounters his murderer. The timing works perfectly. Except, said a new voice from the doorway, that Dora Pike left Mr. Fenner at 20 minutes to 5, and she was witnessed doing so by 3 customers. All eyes turned to see Dora Pike herself standing in the doorway, her face pale but determined. She wore the same brown wool coat she had worn the previous afternoon, but today it seemed to hang more loosely on her frame, as though the events of the past day had somehow diminished her. Miss Pike, Inspector. Slack's tone was professionally neutral, but his eyes held a calculating gleam. Rather to be about, isn't it? I could hardly sleep, Inspector, as you might imagine. When I saw Mr. Simmons arriving in such haste, I thought perhaps— Her voice trailed off as she noticed the letter lying open on the counter. What is that? A letter from the deceased? Slack replied bluntly. Posted after your meeting with him yesterday. In it he specifically mentions your threats. Dora Pike's face went white, then flushed bright red. My threats? Inspector, I may have spoken sharply about the rent increase, but I would hardly call it threatening. And as for posting letters, I left Mr. Fenner at precisely 20 minutes to 5. Mrs. Henderson can confirm it, as can Mrs. Davies and Mr. Collins. They were all 3 in my shop taking their afternoon tea. Then how do you explain this? Slack held up the letter. I cannot explain it, Inspector, because it is impossible. Mr. Fenner was alive and well when I left him, and I went directly back to my shop where I remained until closing time at 6 o'clock. 3 customers can vouch for my presence. Miss Marple had been studying the envelope with increasing interest during this exchange. Now she looked up with that particular expression of polite inquiry that those who knew her well had learned to recognize as significant. Mr. Lorimer, might I ask about the late fee collection? You mentioned it operates until 6:15. That's correct, Miss Marple. It's a service we provide for those who miss the regular collection times. The slot is inside the office, and I personally collect those letters at closing time. And yesterday evening you collected the late fee letters yourself. Of course, Edwin here has a tendency to, well, let us say his handling of the cancellation stamp sometimes lacks precision. I prefer to manage the evening collections myself. Edwin flushed at this comment, but said nothing. Miss Marple noticed, however, that the young man's hands had begun to tremble slightly as he sorted through the morning mail. And the letters go directly to Downshire for processing? In the evening. Mailbag, yes. The postmark would be applied there during the night sorting. Inspector Slack nodded with satisfaction. There you have it. Fenner posted the letter in the late fee slot before 6:15. It went to Downshire in the evening bag and was postmarked at 7:42 during the night sorting. The timeline works perfectly. But Inspector, Dora Pike's voice rose with desperation. I tell you, I left him at 20 to 5, and witnesses saw me return directly to my shop. If Mr. Fenner posted that letter, he did so after I left him. But then who killed him? And why would he write such a thing about me? Miss Marple continued to study the envelope, turning it over in her hands with the care of someone examining a particularly intricate piece of needlework. The postmark was clear enough, she noted, though something about it seemed to trouble her. Miss Pike, she said gently, when you left Mr. Fenner yesterday, was he alone? Quite alone, Miss Marple. He was sitting at his desk writing in that dispatch box of his. He barely looked up when I left. Writing, you're certain? Oh yes, he had his fountain pen in hand and was making notes in his careful way. He was always one for keeping records, was Mr. Fenner. Inspector Slack made a note in his book. Well, that explains how he came to write the letter. Probably composed it immediately after your discussion. But, Inspector, Edwin ventured nervously, there's something rather odd about that postmark. All eyes turned to the young clerk, who flushed under the sudden attention. What do you mean? Slack demanded. Well, sir, it's just that the counsel seems... I mean to say, if you hold it to the light just so... Edwin's voice trailed off under Lorimer's sharp gaze. Miss Marple smiled encouragingly. Please, Edwin, what did you notice? It's probably... Nothing, Miss Marple. But the postmark seems to have been struck twice. There's a fainter impression just beside the clear one, as though someone had tested the stamp first. Really, Pratt, you're seeing things. Mr. Lorimer cleared his throat irritably. The Downshire office uses machine cancellation. Sometimes the letters shift in the mechanism, causing a double impression. It's quite common. But Miss Marple had noticed something else. As she held the envelope to catch the morning light, she observed that the gum on the flap carried a peculiar, faintly sweet scent that reminded her of something she could not quite place. Most interesting, she murmured, though she did not elaborate on what she found so fascinating about the envelope. Inspector Slack, however, was satisfied with his deductions. The case seems clear enough. Fenner writes the letter after his confrontation with Miss Pike, posts it before 6:15, and returns home to meet his killer. The letter points us directly to our suspect. Dora Pike's face crumpled, and she might have fallen had not Edwin quickly stepped forward to offer her a chair. Inspector, she whispered, I swear to you I would never have harmed Mr. Fenner. Sharp words over rent, yes, but murder, never. Miss Marple folded the envelope carefully and handed it back to Mr. Simmons. A most puzzling situation, she said, mildly. Letters posted after death, postmarks that tell impossible stories. One might almost think someone was playing a very elaborate game, but Inspector Slack was already reaching for his handcuffs. Chapter 3. Marple notes gum. Miss Marple had always found that the most revealing truths often resided in the smallest details, those tiny fragments of evidence that others might dismiss as insignificant. It was this philosophy that led her, after Inspector Slack had departed with Dora Pike for further questioning, to request another examination of the mysterious letter. Mr. Simmons, clearly reluctant to part with what he considered crucial evidence, nevertheless could hardly refuse the gentle request of St. Mary Mead's most respected spinster. He handed over the envelope with visible anxiety, watching as Miss Marple settled herself in the chair that Edwin had thoughtfully provided, adjusting her spectacles with the same careful precision she might use when threading a particularly fine needle. Such interesting paper, she murmured. holding the envelope up to catch the morning light that streamed through the post office windows. Good quality, with that lovely watermark. Mr. Fenner always did appreciate fine stationery. Mr. Lorimer, who had been tidying his counter with unnecessary vigor, paused in his activities. Indeed, Miss Marple, Mr. Fenner was most particular about his correspondence materials. He purchased his writing paper from Harrods, if I recall correctly. Miss Marple nodded absently, her attention focused entirely on the envelope in her hands. She turned it over slowly, examining every aspect with the methodical care of someone accustomed to detecting the smallest imperfections in complex patterns. How curious, she said after a moment, bringing the envelope closer to her nose. The gum on the flap has such an unusual scent. Scents, Miss Marple? Indeed, faintly sweet, with just a hint of something spicy, rather like cloves. She glanced around the small office. Tell me, does anyone here work with stamps as a hobby? Collecting, perhaps? The question seemed innocent enough, but Miss Marple had noticed the slight stiffening in Mr. Lorimer's posture, the way his hands had ceased their methodical arrangement of postal forms. I dabble a bit, Lorimer admitted after a moment's hesitation. Nothing serious, you understand. Just a mild interest in postal history. How fascinating, and do you find it necessary to use any special materials in your collecting? Oils perhaps for removing stamps from envelopes? Occasionally. Lorimer's tone had become notably cooler. Clove oil is sometimes employed to soften the gum without damaging the stamp itself. It's a standard technique among philatelists. Course it is, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. How very interesting that this envelope should carry just such a scent. She set the envelope down carefully and reached for the single sheet of paper that had been enclosed within. The message itself was brief, but Miss Marple studied it with the same intense concentration she had devoted to the envelope. Mr. Simmons, might I ask what type of pen Mr. Fenner typically used for his correspondence? The solicitor looked puzzled by the question. His correspondence? Well, I can't say I ever paid particular attention, but I believe he favored a fountain pen. Rather old-fashioned in that regard, was Basil. He often mentioned his dislike of modern writing implements. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes, that would be consistent with my observations of his character. A man of traditional habits. She held the letter closer to the light. How odd, then, that this letter should be written in ballpoint ink. Ballpoint? Mr. Lorimer moved closer, his professional interest apparently aroused. Are you certain, Miss Marple? Oh yes, quite certain. The ink flow is entirely different from that of a fountain pen, you see. Much more consistent, without the slight variations in line weight that one expects from a proper nib. She smiled, gently at the small gathering. One learns to notice such things when one spends as much time with needlework as I do. The quality of a line tells its own story. Edwin cleared his throat nervously. Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but might that not simply mean that Mr. Fenner's fountain pen had run dry? Perhaps he was forced to use whatever was at hand. A very reasonable suggestion, Edwin. However, if we examine Mr. Fenner's dispatch box, Miss Marple gestured toward the collection of papers that Inspector Slack had left on the counter, having apparently deemed them unimportant to his immediate investigation. May I? Mr. Simmons nodded his consent, and Miss Marple began to sort through the deceased man's carefully organized notes and correspondence. Each paper was written in the same precise hand, but the ink told a different story from the mysterious letter. Blue-black fountain pen ink, she observed, holding up several sheets for comparison. Every single document without exception. And notice how the ink spreads just slightly on certain letters, creating that characteristic feathering effect one gets with good writing paper and a well-maintained fountain pen. She set down the papers and picked up the suspicious letter once more. This, by contrast, shows the sharp, even lines of ballpoint ink, quite different and quite inconsistent with Mr. Fenner's usual habits. Mr. Lorimer had grown increasingly quiet during this examination, his thin face taking on the pallor of a man who finds his careful plans unexpectedly scrutinized. "Miss Marple," he said at length, "surely you're not suggesting that this letter was not written by Mr. Fenner? The handwriting is clearly his." "Oh, I make no suggestions at all, Mr. Lorimer. I merely observe." Miss Marple carefully refolded the letter along its original creases, though I must say there is something rather interesting about this fold. She ran her finger lightly along the crease, then examined her fingertip with the attention of a scientist studying a specimen under a microscope. "Sand," she announced quietly. "I beg your pardon." Mr. Simmons leaned forward. "Sand. Or perhaps, more accurately, the fine grit that one finds on blotting paper that has been used for drying ink. The fold has picked up tiny particles, you see. Most interesting, considering that this letter was supposedly written at Mr. Fenner's desk." Edwin looked confused. "But surely Mr. Fenner would have had blotting paper, Miss Marple." "Indeed, he would. But Mr. Fenner's blotting paper." Miss Marple gestured toward the dispatch box where a sheet of clean, unsanded blotting paper lay beside the inkwell. "Is of the modern variety, clean and smooth." She turned her mild gaze toward Mr. Lorimer. "Sand for drying ink is rather old-fashioned nowadays, isn't it? I believe it's mainly used by stationers and post offices for official documents." The silence that followed this observation was broken only by the steady ticking of the clock and the distant sound of village life beginning its daily routine. Mr. Lorimer had gone very still, his hands gripping the edge of the counter with such force that his knuckles had turned white. "Miss Marple," Mr. Simmons said slowly, "are you suggesting that this letter was not written at Mr. Fenner's desk?" "I suggest nothing, dear Mr. Simmons. I merely note what I observe. An envelope that smells of clove oil, commonly used by stamp collectors. A letter written in ballpoint ink by a man who detested such implements. A fold that carries traces of sanded blotting paper. Small things perhaps, but—" She trailed off, folding her hands in her lap with a satisfied air of someone who has completed a particularly challenging piece of needlework. "But taken together," Edwin said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his young face, "they suggest that this letter was not written where we've been told it was written." "You have a quick mind, Edwin," Miss Marple said approvingly. "Yes, these small details do seem to tell their own story, don't they? Though what that story might be." She shook her head with apparent regret. "Well, that's for wiser heads than mine to determine." Mr. Lorimer had begun to edge toward the side door that led to his private office, but Miss Marple's next word stopped him cold. "Of course, there is one more rather curious thing about this envelope," she said conversationally, as though discussing the weather. "Something that struck me the moment I first examined it, though I confess I couldn't quite place what it was. Till now." She held up the envelope once more, studying the postmark with renewed interest. "The cancel is remarkably clear, isn't it? Almost as though it had been applied with particular care, and that faint second impression that Edwin noticed. Well, one might almost think someone had practiced first to ensure the result was properly legible. The morning sun had grown stronger, and in its clear light the tensions in the small post office had become almost palpable. Miss Marple's observation about the unusually clear postmark had created an atmosphere of uncomfortable silence in the post office. Mr. Lorimer stood frozen by the side door, his face bearing the expression of a man who suddenly finds himself walking on very thin ice indeed. Edwin continued his sorting with nervous efficiency, though his glances toward the envelope on the counter had become increasingly frequent and troubled. It was Mr. Simmons who finally broke the silence, his solicitor's mind grappling with the implications of what Miss Marple had discovered. "Miss Marple, if I understand your observations correctly, you're suggesting that this letter was not written under the circumstances we've been led to believe." "I suggest nothing definitive, dear Mr. Simmons," Miss Marple replied with her customary mildness. "I merely note certain inconsistencies, small things to be sure, but sometimes the smallest details reveal the most significant truths." She picked up the envelope once more, handling it with the reverent care of someone examining a particularly delicate piece of ancient lace. Holding it up to the window, where the morning light was strongest, she adjusted her spectacles and peered closely at the postmark. "Edwin mentioned something rather interesting about this cancel mark," she continued thoughtfully. "He observed what appeared to be a double impression. Might I ask you to look at this more closely, dear boy?" Edwin approached with obvious reluctance, clearly aware that his earlier observation had struck some sort of nerve. Nevertheless, his natural honesty compelled him to examine the envelope as requested. "Yes, Miss Marple," he said after a moment's study. "If you hold it just so to catch the light at precisely the right angle, you can see there's a fainter mark just slightly off from the main postmark. It's as though the stamp was applied twice." Miss Marple nodded with satisfaction. "Indeed. And what would you say about the positioning of these two impressions?" Edwin squinted at the envelope, his young face creased with concentration. "Well, the fainter one seems to be just a bit to the left of the clear one, almost as though someone had, well, as though they tested the position first, then struck it again to get it right." "A most astute observation," Miss Marple said warmly. "Now, Mr. Lorimer, you mentioned that letters posted in the late fee box go to Downshire for machine cancellation. Would such a machine produce this sort of double impression?" Mr. Lorimer's throat worked convulsively before he could respond. "Well, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes letters shift in the machinery. It's not entirely uncommon to see slight variations in the cancel marks. But this isn't a shift, is it?" Miss Marple's voice remained pleasantly conversational, but there was something in her mild blue eyes that made Edwin step back slightly. "This appears to be two deliberate applications of a hand cancel, with the second positioned more carefully than the first." The silence that followed this observation was profound. Outside, the sounds of St. Mary Mead going about its morning business continued. But within the post office, time seemed to have stopped entirely. "Miss Marple," Mr. Simmons said slowly, "are you suggesting that this postmark was applied here, rather than at the Downshire sorting office?" "I'm suggesting nothing, dear Mr. Simmons, but I am curious about the cancelled die that would have been used here yesterday evening. Might we examine it?" Mr. Lorimer made no move to comply with this request, standing instead like a statue by his desk. It was Edwin who finally stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "The cancelled die is kept in the drawer here, Miss Marple," he said, pulling open the desk drawer with hands that trembled only slightly. "Mr. Lorimer always keeps it properly maintained." He withdrew a metal hand stamp, its circular die bearing the distinctive markings that would create the postmark. Miss Marple examined it with the same careful attention she had devoted to the envelope. "How very interesting," she murmured. "The die shows recent use, doesn't it? There's still a trace of ink in the deeper recesses of the lettering." "Well, naturally," Mr. Lorimer said, his voice somewhat strained. "I used it for the evening cancellations yesterday, as is my usual practice." "Of course you did," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, "and I'm sure you applied it with your usual precision. Tell me, Edwin, in your experience, does Mr. Lorimer typically require more than one attempt to achieve a clear cancel mark?" Edwin glanced nervously between Miss Marple and his superior. "Well, no, Miss Marple. Mr. Lorimer is very skilled with a hand cancel. He often criticizes my own attempts because they're not as clean and precise as his." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "So it would be quite unusual for Mr. Lorimer to need a practice attempt before achieving the final clear impression we see on this envelope." The implications of this observation hung in the air like a physical presence. Mr. Lorimer had begun to perspire despite the cool morning air, and his grip on the edge of the desk had tightened until his knuckles showed white through the skin. "Miss Marple," he said at length, his voice carefully controlled, "I believe you're reading far too much into what are simply the normal variations one finds in postal processing. The letter went out in yesterday's evening bag, was processed at Downshire during the night sorting, and bears the appropriate postmark. Everything is perfectly regular." "Oh, I'm sure it is," Miss Marple replied with that particular smile that those who knew her well had learned to regard with considerable weariness. "Though I confess I am puzzled by one small detail." She returned her attention to the envelope, studying the postmark with renewed intensity. The timestamp shows 7:42, which would indeed be consistent with night sorting at Downshire, but the date wheel shows yesterday's date, not today's. If this letter had gone through the normal night sorting process, wouldn't one expect it to bear today's date? Edwin blinked in surprise. "Why, yes, Miss Marple, the night sorting begins after midnight, so letters processed then would carry the new day's date. A letter postmarked at 7:42 would have to have been processed yesterday evening, before the night sorting began," Miss Marple concluded gently, "which would mean it was processed here during the regular evening collection period." Mr. Lorimer's face had gone an alarming shade of gray. "The Downshire office sometimes runs behind schedule," he said weakly. "Perhaps they were still processing yesterday's date when this letter came through." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, though combined with this double impression, the careful positioning and the unusually clear result, one might begin to form rather different conclusions about when and where this postmark was applied. She folded the envelope carefully and returned it to Mr. Simmons, who accepted it with the expression of a man handling something that might explode at any moment. "Small details," she said conversationally, "but they do seem to tell their own story, don't they? A story that suggests this letter never left St. Mary Mead at all, but was instead processed right here with considerable care to create the impression that it had been posted and processed according to the normal schedule." Edwin had gone very still, his young face showing the dawning comprehension of someone piecing together a puzzle whose final picture was far darker than he had imagined. "Miss Marple," he whispered, "are you saying that someone deliberately created a false postmark to make it appear that Mr. Fenner had posted this letter after he was already dead?" Miss Marple's smile was sad but knowing. "I'm saying, dear Edwin, that sometimes the truth hides in the smallest details, waiting for someone with enough patience to notice them." Chapter 5. Perfining in the Stamp. The revelation about the postmark had created an atmosphere of considerable tension in the post office, but Miss Marple was far from finished with her examination. She'd returned the envelope to Mr. Simmons, but her attention had now shifted to something else entirely, something that had been nagging at the corner of her consciousness since she had first laid eyes on the mysterious letter. "Mr. Simmons," she said gently, "might I examine the stamp itself just for a moment?" The solicitor, who appeared to be in a state of increasing bewilderment, handed back the envelope without protest. Miss Marple held it up to the light once more, but this time her focus was entirely on the 2 and 6 stamp affixed to the upper right corner. How curious, she murmured after a moment's study. Edwin, dear boy, you have young eyes. Could you look at this stamp and tell me what you see? Edwin approached with obvious nervousness, clearly aware that his every observation seemed to be adding another piece to a puzzle that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for certain members of their small gathering. It appears to be a perfectly ordinary stamp, Miss Marple. 2 shillings and 6pence, current issue, properly affixed. Look more closely, dear. Hold it up to the window and examine it against the light. Edwin did as instructed, squinting at the stamp with a concentration of someone attempting to read fine print. After a moment, his expression changed. Oh, there. There are tiny holes in it, Miss Marple. Little pinpricks arranged in a pattern. They form letters, H and L, I believe. Miss Marple nodded with satisfaction. Indeed they do. A perfin, as it's called. Mr. Lorimer, as our local postal expert, perhaps you could explain to Mr. Simmons what a perfin represents. Mr. Lorimer, who had been growing increasingly pale during this exchange, cleared his throat with obvious reluctance. A perfin is a security measure, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Businesses punch their initials into stamps to prevent theft by employees. It makes the stamps worthless to anyone but the legitimate owner. How very practical, Miss, Marple observed. And the initials HL would stand for... There was a long pause before Lorimer answered. Hugh Lorimer, he said quietly. Your business stamps, in other words, Miss Marple continued pleasantly. How interesting that such a stamp should appear on what is supposedly a private letter from Mr. Fenner to his solicitor. Edwin had been following this exchange with growing comprehension, and now he spoke up with the courage of someone who has finally begun to understand the magnitude of what he was witnessing. But Miss Marple, that can't be right. Mr. Fenner was very particular about his correspondence. He always used his own stamps, and he would never have used a business perfin on a private letter. He considered such things quite improper. He once returned a sheet because one stamp had a small tear, saying it would reflect poorly on his correspondence. Miss Marple turned her mild gaze back to Mr. Lorimer. So we have a man who was extremely particular about the quality of his stamps, allegedly using a perfin-marked business stamp for his final urgent letter to his solicitor. Rather out of character, wouldn't you say? Mr. Lorimer's hands had begun to tremble slightly as he arranged and rearranged the papers on his counter. Perhaps he was in great haste. Perhaps he simply grabbed the first stamp that came to hand, from your business supply. Miss Marple's tone remained conversational, but there was something in her eyes that made even Edwin step back, slightly. Tell me, Mr. Lorimer, do you make a practice of selling your perfin-marked stamps to customers? Certainly not, Lorimer replied quickly. The whole point of a perfin is to prevent unauthorized use. I would never sell such stamps to the public. Of course you wouldn't, Miss Marple agreed, which makes it rather difficult to explain how Mr. Fenner came to possess one, doesn't it? Unless, of course, someone with access to your business supply provided it to him. The silence that followed this observation was broken only by the steady ticking of the post office clock and the distant sound of Mrs. Bantry's car starting. Up outside the draper shop, Mr. Simmons, who had been listening to this exchange with the expression of a man watching a carefully constructed building collapse before his eyes, finally found his voice. Miss Marple, if I understand correctly, you're suggesting that this stamp could only have come from Mr. Lorimer's business supply. I suggest nothing definitive, dear Mr. Simmons. I merely observe that the evidence seems to point in that direction. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap with the air of someone who has completed a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. A private letter bearing a business perfin, written in the wrong ink, folded on paper that picked up sand from blotting paper that the supposed author didn't use, postmarked with what appears to be a local hand cancel rather than a machine cancel from Downshire. She paused, allowing the weight of these accumulated observations to settle over the small gathering. Taken individually, each of these details might have an innocent explanation, but taken together. She shook her head with apparent regret. Well, they do seem to tell a rather different story from the one we were initially asked to believe. Edwin had been growing increasingly agitated during this recitation, and now he burst out with a passion of youth confronting injustice. Miss Marple, are you saying that this letter is a complete fabrication? That someone created it to make it appear that Mr. Fenner had accused Miss Pike of threatening him? I'm saying, dear Edwin, that the physical evidence suggests this letter was not created under the circumstances we were told it was created. As for why someone might have done such a thing, Miss Marple's voice trailed off delicately. Mr. Lorimer had been growing increasingly agitated during this discussion, and now he made a sudden movement toward the side door. I really must attend to the afternoon sorting, he said, his voice strained. If you'll excuse me. Of course, Miss Marple said pleasantly, though I wonder if you might first help us understand how one of your perfin-marked stamps came to be used on this letter. After all, you've explained so clearly that such stamps are never sold to the public. It does present something of a puzzle, doesn't it? Mr. Lorimer stopped with his hand on the door handle, his shoulders sagging as though under a great weight. For a moment, it seemed as though he might continue his retreat, but then he turned back to face the small gathering, his face bearing the expression of a man who has finally reached the end of a very long and difficult road. Perhaps, he said quietly, we should wait for Inspector Slack to return. This matter has become rather more complicated than I initially thought. Miss Marple's smile, that gentle smile that those who knew her well had learned to recognize as the expression of someone who has finally seen all the pieces of a puzzle fall into their proper places. Yes, she said softly. I rather think it has. Chapter 6. The Late Fee Box. The arrival of Mrs. Clement at the post office, bearing her usual cheerful demeanor and a small package wrapped in brown paper, provided a momentary respite from the increasingly tense atmosphere that had developed around the mysterious letter. The vicar's wife entered with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing parish duties and village affairs with equal competence. "Good morning, Mr. Lorimer," she called out pleasantly, apparently oblivious to the charged silence that had preceded her arrival. "I do hope I'm not interrupting anything important. I've only come to post this little parcel to my sister in Bath." Miss Marple turned toward her with that gentle smile that had become so familiar. "To the residents of St. Mary Mead. Good morning, dear Mrs. Clement. How fortuitous that you should arrive just now. I wonder if I might ask you about yesterday evening." Mrs. Clement set her parcel on the counter and regarded Miss Marple with curiosity. "Yesterday evening? Whatever? Do you mean Jane? I believe you posted something here yesterday, did you not? Around tea time, perhaps?" "Oh, yes, indeed I did. My niece's birthday card. I'd been meaning to post it all week and suddenly realized I'd nearly missed the deadline. I rushed over here at the very last moment." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "And you remember the time quite clearly?" "Oh, yes, quite clearly. It was 10 minutes past 6 according to the church clock. I remember because I was worried I might have missed the late fee collection entirely. Mr. Lorimer was just preparing to close the counter." Edwin looked up from his sorting with sudden interest. 10 minutes past 6. You're quite certain, Mrs. Clement?" "Absolutely certain, dear boy. I used the late fee slot, of course, the one inside the office here." She gestured toward a small brass slot built into the counter. "Mr. Lorimer very kindly allowed me to slip it through just before he locked up." For the evening, Miss Marple's eyes had taken on that particular gleam that those who knew her well recognized as significant. The late fee slot, you said, inside the office. Yes, that's right. It's such a convenient service really for those of us who are perpetually running behind schedule. Mrs. Clement laughed at her own admission. I do believe I was the last customer of the day. Mr. Lorimer, who had been standing frozen by the side door throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. Yes, Mrs. Clement was indeed my last customer. I locked the counter immediately after she left. At what time? Miss Marple asked gently. 5:45, as always. Edwin had been listening to this conversation with growing excitement, and now he stepped forward with the eager manner of someone who has just made an important connection. Miss Marple, if Mrs. Clement posted her card at 6:10 and the office closed at 5:45, then no one else could have used the late fee slot after that, could they? A very astute observation, Edwin. Miss Marple's tone was warmly approving, and you would be in a position to know if anyone had attempted to use the external pillar box after the final collection. Oh yes, Miss Marple. I was responsible for securing the building after Mr. Lorimer left. The external pillar box had its final collection at 5:45, and I checked it myself before locking up. It was quite empty. Mrs. Clement looked from one to the other with growing bewilderment. I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I don't quite follow. Is there some significance to the timing of yesterday's collections? Mr. Simmons cleared his throat and held up the envelope that had caused such consternation.
Mrs. Clement, this letter arrived in my morning post, postmarked at 7:42 yesterday evening. It was supposedly posted by Mr. Fenner after his meeting with Miss Pike. But that's impossible, Mrs. Clement said immediately. Poor Mr. Fenner was found dead at 10 minutes to 5. How could he have posted anything at 7:42? Precisely the question that has been troubling us, Miss Marple observed. Though I believe we may be beginning to understand the answer. She turned to Mr. Lorimer, who had grown increasingly pale during this exchange. Tell me, Mr. Lorimer, you mentioned that you personally handle the late fee collections because Edwin's work with the cancellation stamp lacks precision. Is that your usual practice? Yes, Laura replied tightly. I prefer to maintain quality control over all evening processing. And yesterday evening, you collected the late fee letters yourself. Of course. So, Mrs. Clement's birthday card and any other letters in the late fee slot would have passed through your hands exclusively. That's correct. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And these letters would then be placed in the evening bag for transport to Downshire. Yes, naturally. The evening bag that you also prepare and seal personally. There was a slight hesitation before Lorimer answered. Yes. Edwin had been following this line of questioning with growing comprehension, and now he spoke up with barely contained excitement. Miss Marple, are you suggesting that if someone wanted to add a letter to the evening bag after the regular collection times, they would need access to Mr. Lorimer's office and the ability to open and reseal the bag? I'm suggesting nothing. Dear Edwin, I'm merely trying to understand the normal procedures. Miss Marple's tone remained mild, but her eyes held that keen intelligence that missed nothing. Tell me, Mr. Lorimer, what type of seal do you use for the evening bags? Wax seal with the official post office impression. he replied reluctantly. And you keep the sealing wax and stamp in your office? Yes. So someone with access to your office could theoretically open an evening bag, add additional items, and reseal it without detection. The silence that followed this question was profound. Mrs. Clement looked from one face to another with growing alarm, while Edwin stood frozen with a handful of letters clutched in his trembling fingers. Miss Marple, Mr. Simmons said slowly, are you suggesting that this letter was added to the evening bag after the normal collection procedures were completed? I'm suggesting that the evidence appears to point in that direction, Miss Marple replied carefully. A letter that could not have been posted through normal channels, bearing a postmark that suggests local rather than Downshire processing, written with materials consistent with this office rather than Mr. Fenner's study. She paused, allowing the implications to settle over the small gathering, combined with the fact that only one person had access to all the materials and procedures necessary to create such a deception. Mr. Lorimer had begun to sway slightly, his face now ashen. I think I need to sit down. Of course, Miss Marple said gently. This has been a most trying morning for everyone. Edwin, perhaps you could fetch Mr. Lorimer a glass of water. As Edwin hurried to comply, Mrs. Clement moved closer to Miss Marple, her voice dropping to a worried whisper. Jane, are you saying that Mr. Lorimer created this false letter? But why on earth would he do such a thing? Miss Marple's expression was sad, but determined. I fear, dear Mrs. Clement, that we have yet to uncover the full extent of what happened here yesterday evening. But I suspect that before this matter is resolved, we shall discover that poor Mr. Fenner's murder was not the random act of violence it first appeared to be. The morning sun had grown stronger, streaming through the post office windows and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to the truth that was slowly, inexorably being revealed. Chapter 7. Midnight Sorting. The remainder of the morning had passed in a state of subdued tension, with Mr. Lorimer retreating to his office, claiming the need to attend to urgent postal business, while Edwin continued his duties with the nervous efficiency of someone who has suddenly found himself at the center of events far beyond his usual experience. Miss Marple had departed shortly after Mrs. Clement, but not before extracting a promise from Edwin that he would send word immediately if anything unusual occurred. It was this promise that brought Sergeant Lake to Miss Marple's cottage at 11 that evening, his usually staid demeanor showing signs of considerable excitement. Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, he said, removing his helmet as she opened the door to his urgent knocking. But young Edwin Pratt sent word that you'd want to know. There's something happening at the post office. Miss Marple, who had been sitting by her fire with a piece of needlework, set down her embroidery with the calm efficiency of someone who had been expecting just such a summons. Indeed, Sergeant Lake, and what might that be? Well, miss, Edwin was walking past on his way home from the pictures when he noticed a light in the back office. Says he thought it peculiar seeing as how the post office has been closed since 6 o'clock, and Mr. Lorimer told him he'd be working late on the books at home this evening. Miss Marple reached for her coat with the decisive movements of someone who has suddenly found the final piece of a complex puzzle. I think, Sergeant Lake, that we should investigate this matter immediately, and perhaps it would be wise to collect Edwin on our way. His knowledge of the post office procedures may prove invaluable. The walk to the post office took only a few minutes, during which Miss Marple maintained the brisk pace of someone with a definite purpose in mind. Edwin was waiting for them at the corner of the high street, his young face pale but determined. In the lamplight, "The light's still there, Miss Marple," he whispered, pointing toward the rear of the building, where a faint glow was visible through the small window of Mr. Lorimer's private office. "I've been watching for near on 20 minutes, and I've seen his shadow moving about." Miss Marple studied the building with the careful attention of a general surveying a battlefield. "Tell me, Edwin, is there more than one entrance to the building?" "Yes, Miss Marple. There's the main door onto the high street and a side door that leads directly into Mr. Lorimer's office. He has the only key to that one." "And which door would he normally use for after-hours work?" "The side door, miss. It's more private-like." Sergeant Lake adjusted his belt with the air of a man preparing for action. "Shall I knock, Miss Marple? Demand to know what he's about?" "I think not, Sergeant. If Mr. Lorimer is indeed destroying evidence, as I suspect he might be, then an official interruption might cause him to become more careful about his activities. Instead, I suggest we observe for a few more minutes." They positioned themselves in the shadow of the church wall, from where they had an excellent view of both the post office and the narrow lane that ran alongside it. The waiting proved rewarding, for shortly before midnight, the light in the office was extinguished and the side door opened with a soft creak of hinges in need of oil. Mr. Lorimer emerged, moving with the careful stealth of someone who wishes to avoid detection. In his hands, he carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, which he clutched with the intensity of someone handling something of considerable importance. "Where's he going?" Edwin whispered. They had their answer soon enough. As Lorimer made his way to the rear of the building, where the post office's small yard contained the coal bunker and various other utilitarian necessities, he approached what appeared to be a small incinerator used for burning waste paper and postal debris. Missy Marple touched Sergeant Lake's arm lightly. "Now, I think would be an appropriate time for your official intervention." The sergeant moved forward with a heavy tread of authority, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Mr. Lorimer, police. I'd like a word with you, if you please." The effect of this interruption was dramatic. Lorimer spun around with such violence that he nearly dropped his parcel, his face showing the stark terror of someone caught in an act of considerable guilt. "Sergeant Lake, that is to say, I was merely disposing of some old postal forms, routine maintenance. You understand?" "At midnight, sir." Lake's tone was politely skeptical. "Rather unusual hours for Routine maintenance, wouldn't you say? Miss Marple stepped forward into the circle of light cast by the sergeant's torch, her mild demeanor unchanged despite the dramatic circumstances. Good evening, Mr. Lorimer. I do hope we're not interrupting anything important. Lorimer's face went through several rapid changes of expression before settling into a mask of forced calm. Miss Marple, rather late to be abroad, isn't it? Indeed, it is. But then, the same might be said of yourself. Her eyes moved to the parcel in his hands. That appears to be a rather substantial collection of old forms. Might we see what requires such urgent disposal? I'm afraid that's official postal business, Miss Marple. Confidential documents. You understand? Sergeant Lake stepped closer, his official authority lending weight to his words. Mr. Lorimer, I'm going to have to ask you to show me the contents of that parcel. We're investigating a murder, and any unusual activity must be examined. For a moment it seemed as though Lorimer might refuse, but then his shoulders sagged with the defeat of someone who has finally reached the end of a very long road. With trembling hands, he unwrapped the brown paper to reveal its contents. Edwin gasped audibly at what was revealed in the torchlight. The parcel contained several strips of what appeared to be burnt stamp mounting material, a small bottle of clear liquid that gave off the distinctive scent of cloves, and most damning of all, a sheet of paper covered with practice attempts at writing beef fenna in various scripts. Miss Marple examined these items with the satisfaction of someone whose careful deductions have been proven correct. Stamp mounting strips, she observed quietly. Clove oil for loosening stamps from their mounts, and practice sheets for forging a signature. The tools of the trade, as it were. Sergeant Lake was examining Lorimer's hands by the light of his torch. There's something black under your fingernails, sir. Looks like ink and sand, Miss Marple added, noting the telltale particles clinging to Lorimer's cuffs. The same sand that found its way onto the fold of that mysterious letter. Edwin had been staring at the evidence with the wide eyes of someone seeing the final confirmation of suspicions that had been growing throughout the day. Mr. Lorimer, he said quietly, you created that letter, didn't you? You killed Mr. Fenner and then tried to make it look like Miss Pike had threatened him. Lorimer closed his eyes as though in great pain. You don't understand, he whispered. None of you understand what he was going to do to me. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but inexorable. Perhaps, Mr. Lorimer, it's time you helped us to understand. The truth has a way of emerging eventually, and I suspect you'll find it a relief to finally tell it. The midnight air was still and cold around them as Hugh Lorimer began the confession that would finally reveal the full extent of what had transpired in the quiet post office of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 8. Burnt Stamp Mount. The small group had moved inside the post office where Sergeant Lake had insisted on conducting a thorough examination of the premises before allowing Mr. Lorimer to make his statement. The electric lights cast harsh shadows across the familiar counter and sorting areas transforming the mundane workspace into something altogether more sinister. Miss Marple had been particularly interested in examining the small stove that stood in the corner of Mr. Lorimer's office, a relic from earlier days when such heating was necessary for the comfort of postal workers during the long winter months. Now, it served primarily for the disposal of confidential waste, though it appeared to have seen unusual activity in recent hours. "Edwin, dear," she said, kneeling carefully beside the stove, "might you fetch a poker from somewhere? I should like to examine the contents of this ash pan." Edwin hurried to comply, returning with a heavy iron poker that he handed to Miss Marple with the reverence of someone providing a surgeon with a particularly important instrument. Under the watchful eye of Sergeant Lake, she began to carefully sift through the ashes, her movements precise and methodical. "Most interesting," she murmured after a few moments of careful investigation. "Sergeant Lake, you might want to see this." The sergeant leaned closer as Miss Marple used the poker to extract several small fragments from the ash. Even in their charred state, their nature was unmistakable to anyone familiar with philatelic materials. "Glassine mounting corners," she observed, holding up the crisp, transparent fragments used by stamp collectors to mount their specimens without damaging the gum. And here, she probed deeper into the ash. A fragment of wax bearing the impression of the official post office seal. Edwin stared at these discoveries with growing comprehension. But Miss Marple, why would Mr. Lorimer be burning stamp mounting materials? And why would there be sealing wax in his personal stove? Excellent questions, Edwin. Perhaps Mr. Lorimer would care to enlighten us. Mr. Lorimer, who had been standing in frozen silence throughout this investigation, seemed to age visibly under their collective gaze. His thin frame appeared to have shrunk in on itself, and his usually precise clothing looked disheveled and unkempt. "There's no point in pretending any longer, is there?" he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You found everything, the mounting corners, the practice sheets, the clove oil." He gestured helplessly at the evidence scattered before them, "even the wax from where I had to reseal the evening bag." Miss Marple continued her careful excavation of the ashpan, and presently extracted another fragment that made Edwin gasp audibly. "A piece of late fee label backing," she announced, holding up the distinctive yellow paper, the kind used to identify letters posted after regular collection hours. Sergeant Lake made careful notes of each discovery, his methodical documentation providing a stark counterpoint to the increasingly dramatic revelations. "Mr. Lorimer," he said officially, "I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence. However, if you wish to make a statement explaining these items, I'm prepared to listen." Lorimer nodded slowly, his resistance finally crumbling under the weight of the accumulated evidence. "It started innocently enough," he began, his voice taking on the hollow tone of someone confessing a long-held secret. The postal savings accounts. You understand? Such small amounts, and the books were always slightly out at month's end. A shilling here, sixpence there. I told myself I was merely borrowing against future deposits. Miss Marple had moved to examine Mr. Lorimer's desk, where she discovered additional evidence of his activities. In the top drawer, carefully hidden beneath a stack of official forms, she found his Perfin punch card bearing the distinctive HL pattern, a newly purchased ballpoint pen still in its wrapper, and a sheet of blotting paper liberally sprinkled with the fine sand that had left its telltale traces on the forged letter. But the borrowing became more substantial over time, she observed, gently, holding up a small notebook filled with figures in Lorimer's precise handwriting. These appear to be records of wages placed at the Downshire racecourse. Rather substantial amounts by the look of it. Edwin peered over her shoulder at the notebook, his young face showing the shock of someone discovering that a trusted figure has feet of clay. Mr. Lorimer, you've been gambling with the postal savings funds. Not gambling, Lorimer protested weakly. Investing. I had a system, you see. A way of predicting the winners based on past performance and track conditions. It should have worked. It would have worked if not for that cursed horse at Newmarket last month. Dr. Haydock, who had arrived at Sergeant Lake's summons, emerged from his re-examination of the crime scene with a grim expression. I've had another look at poor Fenner's injuries, he announced. Most interesting findings. The skull fracture shows two distinct impact patterns, as though the doorstop was lifted and struck again, the sort of thing one might expect if the attacker had panicked and tried to ensure the victim was truly dead. He paused, consulting his notes in the lamplight. Also, I found traces of that distinctive clove scent in Fenner's parlor. Very faint, but definitely present. And no traces whatsoever of the tea shop flower or lavender water that Miss Pike would have carried on her clothing. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Fenner had discovered the irregularities in the accounts, hadn't he, Mr. Lorimer? That's why you were in his parlor yesterday afternoon. Lorimer's composure finally cracked entirely, and he slumped into his desk chair with the deflated appearance of a punctured balloon. He'd been asking questions about the postal savings balances, said the figures didn't match his own records, threatened to write to the Downshire office, demanding a full audit. Lorimer's voice broke slightly. I tried to explain, tried to make him understand that I could replace the money if I'd just give me time, but he was adamant, said his duty was clear. So you struck him with the doorstop, Sergeant Lake said matter-of-factly. It wasn't planned, Lorimer burst out. I'd gone to his parlor to collect some notepaper, and he confronted me about the accounts. We argued, and he turned to reach for his dispatch box, saying he was going to write to Simmons immediately. I picked up the doorstop without thinking, just meant to frighten him, to make him listen, but it slipped in my hands, and when I tried to catch it, he shuddered at the memory, the sound it made when it struck him. I knew immediately that I'd killed him. Edwin had been listening to this confession with a horrified fascination of someone witnessing a motor car accident. But the letter, Mr. Lorimer, why did you create that awful letter accusing Miss Pike? Panic, Lorimer replied simply. Pure panic. I knew suspicion would fall on her because of their quarrel. Everyone had heard them arguing. I thought if I could create evidence that Fenner himself suspected her, it would deflect any investigation away from the financial irregularities, away from me. Miss Marple had been examining the remaining contents of the desk drawer, and now she held up a small tube of adhesive. Special gum, she observed, reading the label. For philatelic purposes. The same sweet scent I detected on the envelope. Flap. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with the inexorable precision of a well-constructed timepiece. Each revelation adding another layer to the elaborate deception that Hugh Lorimer had constructed in his desperate attempt to conceal both murder and embezzlement. The truth has a way of emerging, Miss Marple said softly. No matter how carefully one tries to bury it. The confession had created a heavy silence in the post office, broken only by the steady scratching of Sergeant Lake's pencil as he recorded the details of Mr. Lorimer's statement. Miss Marple, however, was far from finished with her examination of the evidence. She had returned to the mysterious letter, studying it with the same meticulous attention she might have devoted to a particularly complex piece of embroidery. Mr. Lorimer, she said presently, you mentioned that you traced Mr. Fenner's handwriting from old dockets. Might we see some examples of his genuine writing? Edwin, who had been following the proceedings with the fascination of someone witnessing the unraveling of an elaborate mystery, hurried to retrieve several documents from Fenner's dispatch box. Here are some of his prescription records from when he was still practicing, Edwin offered, spreading the papers on the counter, and some recent correspondence about property matters. Miss Marple examined these documents with her customary thoroughness, comparing them carefully with the forged letter. After several minutes of study, she looked up with that particular expression of satisfaction that indicated she had discovered something significant, most illuminating, she murmured. Tell me, Mr. Lorimer, when you created your forgery, did you have access to any of Mr. Fenner's medical prescriptions? Lorimer looked puzzled by the question. Yes, he occasionally brought in prescriptions to be posted to his former patients. Why do you ask? Because, Miss Marple said gently, you've made a rather telling error in your reproduction of his writing habits. She held up one of Fenner's medical documents. He writes the abbreviation for 3 times daily as tudus. The correct Latin abbreviation, terdae sumendum. She then indicated the forged letter, but in your version, you've written T.ID, which is the American pharmaceutical abbreviation ter in die. Mr. Fenner, with his proper English medical training, would never have used such a form. He considered American medical practices rather vulgar and was quite particular about maintaining proper Latin usage. Edwin leaned closer to examine the documents. I remember Mr. Fenner commenting on that very thing just last month when Dr. Haydock mentioned some American medical journal. He said their abbreviated prescriptions were sloppy and showed a deplorable lack of classical education. Dr. Haydock, who had been listening to this exchange with professional interest, nodded his agreement. Quite right. Basil was rather a stickler for proper pharmaceutical notation. He once spent 10 minutes lecturing me about the importance of maintaining traditional Latin forms in prescription writing. Miss Marple continued her systematic comparison of the documents. There are other inconsistencies as well. Mr. Fenner's genuine letters always show this characteristic feathering of the ink, whereas fountain pen created slight variations in line weight. Your forgery, written with a ballpoint pen, shows none of these natural variations. She indicated another detail on the authentic correspondence. And notice how Mr. Fenner always sealed his personal letters with a red wafer, never trusting to gum alone. He believed it gave his correspondence a more distinguished appearance. Lorimer had been growing increasingly pale during this detailed analysis of his deception. I tried to make it as accurate as possible. I studied his handwriting for weeks. Indeed, you did, Miss Marple agreed, and it's quite a skillful forgery in many respects. But habits of a lifetime are difficult to replicate perfectly, especially when one is working under considerable stress. Sergeant Lake looked up from his notes. Miss Marple, you mentioned earlier that the postmark itself provided evidence of local processing rather than the Downshire sorting office. Could you explain that in more detail? Certainly, Sergeant. The double strike that Edwin so astutely observed indicates a hand cancel rather than machine processing. But more significantly, the postmark bears yesterday's date rather than today's. Letters processed during the night sorting at Downshire would carry today's date, as that work begins after midnight. She held the envelope up to the light once more. This postmark was applied yesterday evening here in St. Mary Mead by someone using the office hand cancel. The precision of the final strike, combined with a practice attempt, suggests someone very familiar with the proper technique. Edwin had been examining the cancel die that still lay on the counter. Miss Marple, there are still traces of ink in the deeper parts of the letters. Fresh ink, not dried and flaky like it would be if it had been used days ago. Another excellent observation, Edwin. The evidence consistently points to this letter being processed here yesterday evening after the normal collection procedures were completed. Dr. Haydock had been conducting his own examination of the physical evidence. I've also been thinking about the clove oil scent that Miss Marple detected. In my experience, such scents don't linger long in paper unless the exposure was quite recent and concentrated. This suggests the envelope was handled by someone who had been working extensively with clove oil very recently. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. All the evidence points to a single conclusion. This letter was created here in this office using materials readily available to someone with access to the postal supplies and procedures. She turned to address Lorimer directly. You had everything you needed, didn't you? access to Mr. Fenner's handwriting from old dockets, your own business stamps with the HL perfin, the ballpoint pen you'd recently purchased, the clove oil from your stamp collecting activities, and most importantly, the knowledge and authority to process the letter through the evening bag without detection. Lorimer's shoulders sagged further with each point in Miss Marple's methodical reconstruction of his crime. The irony, Miss Marple continued gently, is that if you had simply reported finding Mr. Fenner's body without attempting this elaborate deception, the investigation might never have uncovered the financial irregularities you were so desperate to hide. It was the very act of trying to deflect suspicion onto poor Miss Pike that drew attention to all the small inconsistencies that betrayed you. Edwin shook his head in amazement. All those tiny details, the wrong ink, the wrong abbreviation, the wrong scent on the envelope. How did you notice them all, Miss Marple? Miss Marple smiled with the gentle satisfaction of someone whose patient work has been vindicated. One learns, dear Edwin, that the truth often hides in the smallest details. When something claims to be what it is not, it invariably betrays itself through tiny inconsistencies, like a piece of needlework done with the wrong thread. It may look correct from a distance, but close examination always reveals the deception. The weight of evidence had become overwhelming, and Hugh Lorimer finally completed his confession with the defeated air of a man who had run out of both lies and energy. The elaborate structure of deception he had constructed to hide his crimes had crumbled under Miss Marple's patient examination, revealing the truth in all its sordid detail. Outside, the church clock chimed 1 o'clock, marking the end of a day that had begun with apparent certainty about Mr. Fenner's murder and concluded with the revelation of a far more complex web of crime and desperation than anyone in St. Mary Mead could have imagined. Chapter 10. Posted and Proven. The morning sun had risen over St. Mary Mead with its customary serenity, seemingly oblivious to the dramatic events that had unfolded during the dark hours. The post office, which had been the scene of such revelations, now stood with its front blinds raised, ready to resume the mundane business of serving the village's postal needs. Yet the atmosphere within bore little resemblance to the peaceful efficiency that had characterized it under Hugh Lorimer's stewardship. Inspector Slack had arrived at dawn, his manner betraying considerable irritation at having been summoned to deal with what he had initially assumed would be a straightforward case of village passion leading to murder. Instead, he found himself confronting a complex web of embezzlement, forgery, and calculated deception that challenged his preference for simple solutions to criminal matters. So let me understand this correctly, he said, consulting his notebook with the air of a man trying to impose order on chaos. Lorimer killed Fenner to prevent exposure of his theft from the postal savings accounts, then created this elaborate forgery to implicate Miss Pike, Miss Marple, who had spent the early morning hours ensuring that all the evidence was properly preserved and documented, nodded with quiet satisfaction. "That is correct, Inspector. Though I believe a complete understanding requires us to examine the precise sequence of events."
"Miss Marple," he ventured, "might you explain exactly how Mr. Lorimer managed to create the illusion that Mr. Fenner had posted the letter after his death?" "Certainly, Edwin. The method was quite ingenious, though ultimately betrayed by those small details that always reveal the truth." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and began her systematic reconstruction of the crime. "At 5 minutes past 5 yesterday afternoon, Mr. Lorimer entered Mr. Fenner's parlor, ostensibly to collect notepaper for official correspondence. Mr. Fenner confronted him about the irregularities in the postal savings accounts that his meticulous record-keeping had revealed. When Fenner threatened to contact Mr. Simmons immediately to demand an audit, Lorimer struck him with the iron doorstop." She paused, allowing the weight of this simple statement to settle over her audience. The blow was fatal, but Lorimer, in his panic, lifted the doorstop and struck again, creating the double arc pattern that Dr. Haydock observed. Realizing what he had done, Lorimer faced the immediate problem of deflecting suspicion from himself, and more importantly, preventing any investigation that might uncover his financial crimes. Inspector Slack had been taking notes throughout this recitation, and that's when he conceived the plan to implicate Miss Pike. Precisely. Miss Pike's quarrel with Fenner was public knowledge, witnessed by several customers. Lorimer realized that suspicion would naturally fall upon her, but he needed evidence that would seem to come from Fenner himself. Miss Marple moved to the display of evidence, indicating each item as she explained its significance. Using his skills as a forger developed through his philatelic interests, Lorimer traced Fenner's handwriting from old dockets and correspondence. However, working under considerable stress and using unfamiliar materials, he made several crucial errors. She held up the forged letter beside one of Fenner's genuine prescriptions. He used a ballpoint pen rather than Fenner's customary fountain pen, creating ink lines of uniform weight rather than the natural variations Fenner's writing always showed. He employed the wrong Latin abbreviation, using the American TID instead of Fenner's proper TIDs, and he sealed the envelope with gum alone when Fenner invariably used red wafers for his personal correspondence. Edwin nodded with growing understanding. "And the stamp, the one with your perfin marks." "Ah, yes, the stamp." Miss Marple's tone took on that note of gentle satisfaction that indicated a particularly important point. Lorimer used one of his own business stamps marked with the HL perfin to prevent theft. Such stamps are never sold to the public, making it impossible for Fenner to have legitimately possessed one. She moved to the envelope, holding it up to catch the morning light. The clove oil scent on the envelope flap came from Lorimer's recent philatelic work, and the sand embedded in the fold was picked up from the blotting paper he used for drying official documents. Most telling of all, the postmark itself bears the evidence of local hand cancellation rather than machine processing. At Downshire, Inspector Slack looked up from his notes. The double strike that young Edwin noticed. Exactly. Someone unfamiliar with applying postmarks might well need a practice attempt before achieving the clear, official-looking result. And the date on the postmark proves it was applied yesterday evening, not during the night sorting that would have given it today's date. Dr. Haydock, who had arrived to provide his final medical report, added his own observations to the growing case against Lorimer. The physical evidence from the crime scene supports this reconstruction completely. The clove scent in Fenner's parlor, the pattern of the skull fracture, and the complete absence of any traces that would link Miss Pike to the scene. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. After creating the forged letter, Lorimer had only to wait until the office closed normally, then use his exclusive access to add it to the evening bag. He opened the wax seal, inserted the letter, and resealed the bag with his official stamp. The letter would then appear in the downshire processing, as though it had been posted through normal channels. Mr. Simmons, who had been listening to this explanation with the absorbed attention of someone whose professional understanding of evidence was being thoroughly educated, shook his head in amazement. The complexity of it all. If he had simply reported finding the body, as Miss Marple suggests, the financial irregularities might never have been discovered. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. It was the very attempt to create a false trail of evidence that led to the revelation of the truth. Each lie required additional lies to support it, and each additional deception created new opportunities for small errors to accumulate. Inspector Slack had completed his notes, and now looked up with the satisfied air of a man who has finally brought order to a chaotic situation. Well, that seems to wrap up the case nicely. Lorimer's in custody. The evidence is overwhelming, and Miss Pike is cleared of all suspicion. There is one final matter, Miss Marple said quietly. The postal savings audit will undoubtedly reveal the full extent of Mr. Lorimer's embezzlement, but I suspect the amounts involved will prove to be considerably larger than his confession suggested. Gambling debts have a way of growing beyond one's initial estimates. Edwin, who would now bear the responsibility of cooperating with the financial investigation, nodded soberly. I'll ensure that all the records are made available to the auditors. Miss Marple, poor Mr. Fenner kept such meticulous books that the discrepancies should be easy to identify. As the various officials began to disperse, each to attend to their respective duties in bringing this matter to its proper conclusion, Lady Bantry arrived at the post office with her customary dramatic flair. Jane, I've just heard the most extraordinary rumors. Something about Hugh Lorimer and a forged letter. Miss Marple smiled with the gentle satisfaction of someone whose patient work has finally borne fruit. All quite true, I'm afraid, Dolly. Though I suspect the full story will prove even more extraordinary than the rumors suggest. Lady Bantry exhaled dramatically, her eyes bright with the excitement of someone who has stumbled upon the most delicious piece of village gossip in years. All from a postmark, you said yesterday. How absolutely remarkable, Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and prepared to leave the post office, which was already beginning to return to something approaching normal operations under Edwin's nervous but determined management. Posts, dear Dolly. Tell where a letter has been, she said softly. Not when a soul is gone. With that observation, she stepped out into the peaceful morning air of St. Mary Mead, leaving behind the scene of a crime that had been solved not through dramatic confrontation or brilliant deduction, but through the patient accumulation of small truths that, taken together, had revealed a larger and more terrible reality. The village would recover as villages always do, though the post office would never again seem quite the symbol of unshakable trustworthiness it had once appeared to be.